The doorbell rang at 4:47 p.m. on a Sunday, and that was the first thing wrong. Karen never brought Elliot back early. In 6 years of shared custody, she had squeezed every last minute from her weekends, like a woman wringing water from a dish rag. She'd kept him late dozens of times. Birthdays, holidays. Once during a thunderstorm she claimed made the roads unsafe, while I sat in the driveway of her apartment complex, waiting for 45 minutes. But early? Never. Not once. I set down my coffee mug and crossed the living room of the house I'd kept after the divorce. 3 bedrooms in a quiet subdivision outside of Ashburn, Virginia. The kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways and complained about crabgrass on the community forum. I opened the front door expecting to see Karen's silver Nissan idling at the curb, maybe her boyfriend Marcus behind the wheel looking at his phone, and Elliot trudging up the steps with his weekend bag slung over one shoulder. Instead, Elliot stood alone on the porch. No car, no Karen, no weekend bag. He was 9 years old, wearing the same red hoodie and jeans he'd left in on Friday afternoon. His sneakers were muddy, not regular mud dark, almost black, with a smell that reminded me of wet copper and something sour underneath. His hair was matted on one side like he'd been lying down somewhere damp. And his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. They were open and clear and looking directly at me. But there was something behind them that had pulled back. Some part of my son had retreated to a room deep inside himself and locked the door. Elliot? I knelt down. Hey, buddy, where's Mom? He walked past me into the house without answering. Not running, not crying, just walking with a mechanical steadiness that didn't belong to a 9-year-old. He went straight to the couch, sat down, and stared at the television, which wasn't on. I looked up and down the street. The Hendersons' lawn across the road was freshly cut. Jerry Pratchett was hosing down his truck 2 houses south. Everything looked normal. The sky was overcast, the color of an old bruise, and there was a heaviness to the air that I chalked up to the weather front they'd been talking about on the news. A cold front moving south out of Pennsylvania, unusual for mid-September. I closed the door and locked it out of habit. Elliot, did Mom drop you off? Did Marcus drive you? Nothing. He sat with his hands flat on his knees, staring at the black screen. I sat beside him, keeping a few inches of space, trying to read whatever language his silence was written in. You hungry? I can make those dinosaur nuggets you like. His lips moved. I leaned closer. Don't open the door again, he said. My chest did something involuntary. A cold clenching that started behind my ribs and climbed into my throat. I'd been a communications officer in the Army for 8 years before Elliot was born. I'd sat in rooms where men spoke calmly about terrible things. I knew what controlled fear sounded like. And my 9-year-old son was speaking with the measured cadence of someone who had decided that panic was a luxury he could not afford. Why, buddy? Why can't I open the door? He turned his head and looked at me. For a single, unbroken moment, I saw everything: exhaustion, terror, grief, and something harder underneath all of it. Something I didn't have a word for until much later. Because they follow you if they see your face. I picked up my phone and called Karen. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same result. I texted her, Elliot's home. Where are you? Call me. The message showed as delivered but never switched to read. Jerry Pratchett's hose shut off outside. In the quiet that followed, I heard something I hadn't noticed before: a distant sound. Rhythmic and strange, like dozens of car alarms going off miles away, layered over each other until they became a single, uneven pulse. Elliot didn't flinch. He'd already heard it. I tried Karen 4 more times over the next hour. Each call rang out and landed in the polite void of her voicemail greeting. I called Marcus's number, which I kept only for emergencies. His phone didn't ring at all. It went straight to a dead, automated tone. The kind you get when a number has been disconnected or a carrier network is overloaded. Elliot hadn't moved from the couch. I brought him water and a granola bar. He drank the water in small, careful sips, but didn't touch the food. I turned on the television, hoping a cartoon might pull him back to the surface. The local CBS affiliate was mid-broadcast, but not with regular programming. A news desk, 2 anchors, the woman speaking quickly while her co-anchor stared at something off-camera with an expression I recognized from my service days, the face of someone receiving information they cannot integrate fast enough, urging residents in Loudoun, Fairfax, and Prince William counties to shelter in place. Authorities have not confirmed the nature of the outbreak, but multiple hospitals in the Northern Virginia corridor are reporting capacity overflow. Metropolitan Police and Fairfax County Emergency Services have established a joint perimeter along Route 7. The graphic behind her showed a map of Northern Virginia with red shading spreading from what appeared to be centered around Leesburg, about 22 miles northwest of my house. Karen's apartment was in Leesburg. I looked at Elliot. He was watching the screen now, but not with surprise, with confirmation. "Elliot, were you at Mom's apartment this weekend?" A small nod. "Did something happen there?" He pulled his knees up to his chest. "Marcus got sick on Saturday morning. He was shaking and his eyes went red. Mom told me to go to my room and lock the door." He spoke flatly, like he was reading a report aloud. Then I heard Mom screaming. Then she stopped. The room tilted. I pressed my hands against my knees and forced myself to breathe through my nose, like I was back in training, regulating oxygen, slowing the heart rate, buying the brain time to process. My ex-wife might be dead. My son had witnessed something that had aged him 10 years in 36 hours. And the television was telling me it wasn't isolated. "How did you get home, buddy?" "I walked." "You walked 22 miles?" "I walked at night. During the day, I hid." He said this as though it were obvious. They're slower when it's cold. At night, it was cold. I wanted to hold him, but something in his posture told me that touch would shatter whatever architecture of control he'd built to get himself here. So I sat beside him, and I listened and I watched the news anchor lose her composure on live television as reports poured in from across the D.C. metropolitan area. Within 30 minutes, the broadcast cut to the emergency alert system. The familiar harsh tones filled my living room, and the scrolling text instructed all residents to remain indoors, seal windows and doors, and avoid contact with any individuals displaying signs of extreme agitation, discolored eyes, or unresponsive communication. I moved through the house with a focus that surprised me. Training doesn't leave your body, it waits in your muscles for the world to go wrong. I locked every window. I drew every curtain and blind. I checked the back door, the garage entry, the basement window wells. I pulled my old service footlocker from the closet in the master bedroom and opened it for the first time in 3 years. Inside, a first aid kit, a hand crank radio, 2 flashlights, a fixed blade knife, and a Beretta M9 with 2 full magazines. I'd kept the pistol legally registered and stored according to Virginia law, trigger locked and ammunition separate. When I came back downstairs with the footlocker, my neighbor Diane Hargrove was standing on my front porch, visible through the sidelight window beside the door. She was 63 years old, a retired school librarian who brought Elliot books every Christmas. She was pressing her face against the glass, and her eyes were the color of burst capillaries, solid, swimming red, and her mouth was open in a shape that wasn't speech. Elliot didn't look. He already knew. "They followed someone on our street," he said quietly. "I saw 2 of them on Maple Court when I came in." Diane's palm hit the glass with a sound like a raw steak dropped on tile. Then again. Then a 3rd time, faster. I pulled Elliot off the couch and moved him to the interior hallway, away from all windows. Diane Hargrove stood on my porch for 11 minutes. I timed it on the kitchen clock because counting gave me something to do besides listen. Her palm strikes against the sidelight glass settled into a rhythm. 3 hits, pause, 3 hits, pause, almost like she was knocking politely for the first few rounds. Then the rhythm broke apart. The hits became constant, wet, overlapping, and I could hear the glass flexing in its frame. I knelt in the hallway with Elliot behind me and the Beretta in my hands, magazine seated, safety on. I hadn't fired that weapon since a range day 4 years ago. But the weight of it was a language my palms still understood. Then Diane stopped. I heard her footsteps drag off the porch and down the front walk. And through the narrow gap at the edge of the living room curtain, I watched her move across the street toward the Hendersons' house. She wasn't walking the way a person walks. Her gait was a lurching forward lean, like she was perpetually catching herself from falling. Her arms loose at her sides and her head tilted at an angle that suggested the muscles in her neck had stopped coordinating. She reached the Hendersons' front door and began hitting it the same way she'd hit mine. I turned to Elliot. "Can you tell me more about what they do? How they act?" He thought about this with a seriousness I found both admirable and devastating. "They hear things. If you make noise, they come to the noise. If you're quiet and they can't see you, they forget about you. But if they see your face, they remember. They follow that face." "How do you know that?" "Because one of them saw me in Leesburg, and it followed me for 6 miles. I had to go through the creek behind Braddock Road to lose it. The water confused it. My son had developed a working behavioral model for whatever these things were, while walking 22 miles home through hostile territory. The part of me that was still his father wanted to collapse. The part of me that was still a soldier filed the intelligence. My phone buzzed. Not Karen, a text from my buddy Ray Callahan, who lived in the development behind mine. Ray was a former Marine, now a contractor who installed commercial HVAC systems. We'd bonded at a neighborhood barbecue 3 years ago over shared service backgrounds and a mutual distrust of HOA leadership. "Ben, you seeing this? I've got my family in the basement. Count 6 of those things on Willow Lane. They're going house to house, testing doors. Get underground if you can." I texted back, "Elliot's here. Just the 2 of us. Garage and all entries locked. Heading to basement." His reply came fast. "Good. Stay dark. No lights after sunset. They orient to light sources, too." I watched one track a porch light for 20 minutes. I grabbed the footlocker, a case of bottled water from the pantry, a box of granola bars, a bag of apples, and 2 sleeping bags from the camping gear in the garage closet. I made 2 trips to the basement, moving quickly and quietly, while Elliot waited at the top of the stairs, watching me with those ancient eyes. The basement was half finished. One side had carpet and drywall, an old couch, and a television I never hooked up. The other side was bare concrete with the furnace, water heater, and utility access. 2 window wells let in thin light at ground level, each about 12 inches high and 30 inches wide. Too small for an adult to climb through. But I covered them anyway with pieces of plywood from my workshop corner and secured them with duct tape. I set up the sleeping bags on the carpeted side and arranged our supplies against the wall. I turned on the hand crank radio and worked the handle until it caught a signal. The station was broadcasting emergency information on a loop. Shelter in place. Do not approach symptomatic individuals. Boil water before consuming. Avoid all unnecessary travel. The governor had activated the National Guard. Dulles Airport was closed. Interstate 66 was gridlocked from Manassas to the Beltway. Elliot sat on his sleeping bag and pulled his knees to his chest again. In the thin light of the basement, he looked impossibly small. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." Mom locked me in my room to keep me safe. She knew what Marcus was turning into, and she put herself between us. I sat down next to him. This time I did put my arm around him, and he leaned into me, and I felt the entire weight of his 36 hours land on my shoulder like a continent shifting. "She was brave," I said. "She was scared," he corrected, "but she did it anyway." Above us, through the floor joists and the subfloor and the hardwood and the locked doors and the drawn curtains, I heard Diane Hargrove begin striking the Hendersons' front window hard enough to break it. The sound of shattering glass carried across the street and into my house like a starter pistol. Then the Hendersons' screaming started. We listened to the Hendersons die. That's the accurate way to say it. And I won't dress it up in softer language, because they deserve better than my comfort. Tom Henderson was 58 and repaired antique clocks in a workshop behind his garage. His wife Gloria made lemon bars for every block party and remembered the name of every child on the street. They had a daughter in college in Richmond, and a beagle named Captain, who barked at squirrels with a passion that suggested he genuinely believed he could catch one. The screaming lasted maybe 90 seconds. Gloria first, high and shredding, a sound that punched through walls and foundation and settled in the marrow of my spine. Then Tom's voice, deeper, a shout that cracked into something ragged before cutting off with a finality that left the air hollow. Then nothing from them. Captain barked for another minute, frantic staccato bursts, and then that stopped too. Elliot pressed his face against my chest. I held him with one arm and the Beretta with the other, and I stared at the basement ceiling like I could see through it. The hand crank radio continued its loop. I turned the volume down to barely audible and pressed my ear close. Between the automated messages, a live announcer broke in with updates that arrived like hammer blows. The outbreak was confirmed in 17 states. Hospitals in D.C., Baltimore, and Philadelphia were no longer accepting patients. The CDC had classified the pathogen as a novel neurological agent transmitted through fluid contact saliva, blood, open wounds. Incubation ranged from 4 hours to 16 hours. There was no treatment. There was no vaccine. Infected individuals displayed extreme aggression, diminished pain response, and a clustering behavior that researchers were still attempting to understand. Clustering behavior. I thought about what Elliot had said: they follow your face. They remember. That wasn't random aggression. That was targeting. I texted Ray. Hendersons are gone. Diane Hargrove got in through their front window. His response took 3 minutes. I know. I heard. We've got 8 people in my basement now. Me, Lisa, both kids, plus the Okafor family from 2 doors down. Nkem Okafor got bit trying to get his car started. He says he's fine. He's not fine, Ben. I can see it starting in his eyes. The weight of that message sat in my hand like a stone. Ray was in a basement with his wife and children and a man who was turning. I typed carefully. You need to isolate him. Separate room. Lock it. Now. Yeah, I know. His wife Grace has their 2 kids with her. She won't let me move him. Says I'm overreacting. Ray, do not wait. Working on it. I set the phone down and checked the battery. 61%. I had a portable charger upstairs in the kitchen drawer, fully loaded. I calculated whether the trip was worth the risk. The house was locked, curtains drawn, but every footstep on the hardwood above was a sound source, and Elliot had explained with the clarity of a field researcher that sound was their primary tracking mechanism. I decided to wait. Move at first light, when I could see and plan, and the cold of early morning might slow them down, if Elliot's observations held true. Dad, we need to leave this house. Elliot's voice came from somewhere against my shirt, muffled but firm. Not tonight, buddy. We're safe down here. We're safe right now. But they saw Diane go into the Hendersons' house. More will come to this street because there's noise here now. They follow noise, and then they find faces, and then they stay. I looked at my son and tried to reconcile the boy who still slept with a stuffed triceratops named Sergeant Stomps, with the tactician currently advising me on infected movement patterns. The reconciliation failed. Both existed simultaneously. And I realized that trauma doesn't replace childhood. It just builds a second floor on top of it and forces the child to live on both levels at once. Where do you think we should go? Somewhere with no people. People make noise. Noise brings them. He was right. Every survival instinct in the civilian playbook said find other people, group together, share resources. But the math of this situation was different. People were vectors. People panicked. People screamed and fought and drew the infected like moths to open flame. I pulled up the map application on my phone. Cell service was degrading, but the GPS still functioned from cached data. I studied the terrain west of Ashburn, toward the Blue Ridge, where population density dropped sharply and the forest thickened into something old and indifferent. What about the cabin? Elliot said. He meant my father's hunting cabin outside of Bluemont, in the foothills. 38 miles west. No neighbors within a mile. Well water, a wood stove, and a root cellar stocked with canned goods that my father refreshed every autumn out of a Depression-era habit he'd inherited from his own mother. I hadn't been there in 2 years, but I had a key on my ring. 38 miles. With a 9-year-old, on foot if we had to be, through territory that was actively hostile. I started planning. I slept in 40-minute increments that night. Each stretch ended by a sound from above. A thud against the siding, a creak on the front porch, once a dragging scrape across the garage door that lasted long enough for me to chamber around and aim at the basement stairs before it faded. Elliot slept deeper than I expected, curled in his sleeping bag with his hood pulled up, his breathing even and slow. His body had learned during his walk home that sleep was a resource you seized when available, not a luxury you scheduled. At 5:15 a.m., I woke fully and checked my phone. 38% battery. 2 texts from Ray sent at 2:47 a.m. and 3:12 a.m. The first. Unkempt turned. Grace wouldn't let me lock the door. He got to one of the Okafor kids before I could pull him off. I had to use the crowbar. Grace is hysterical. Lisa took our kids to the utility room. I'm standing guard. Ben, his eyes went red in under an hour once the shaking started. If anyone in your proximity gets bit, you have 4 hours maximum, and it's probably less. The second, the Okafor boy Chidi is bit on the forearm. He's 7. I don't know what to do with this information. Tell me what to do with this information. I stared at those words for a long time. Ray Callahan was a man who'd cleared buildings in Fallujah, who'd carried a wounded squad mate 2 kilometers under fire, who rebuilt industrial cooling systems with the same calm precision he applied to everything in his life. and he was asking me what to do about a 7-year-old boy with a bite wound who had 4 hours left as a human being. I typed, "Isolate Chidi in a separate space. Make him comfortable. Keep him away from everyone else. If Grace objects, tell her it's to keep him safe while you figure out next steps. Don't frame it as containment. Frame it as care." Then I added, "We're leaving at dawn, heading west to my father's cabin near Bluemont. You should consider moving too. This neighborhood is compromised." His reply came in 1 minute. "Copy. I'll figure out the Okafor situation. May head south toward Lisa's parents in Culpeper. Stay on comms. Be careful, brother." I woke Elliot gently. He opened his eyes instantly, fully alert. No transition from sleep to waking, another adaptation he'd developed on his walk home. "We're going to Grandpa's cabin," I told him. "We're leaving in 30 minutes. He nodded and started rolling his sleeping bag. No argument, no questions. I moved upstairs in socked feet, distributing my weight along the edges of each step where the wood was firmest and least likely to creak. The house was dim, curtains still drawn, early gray lights seeping around the edges. I peered through the side light beside the front door. The street was different. 3 cars had been abandoned at odd angles, doors open, dome lights dead. The Hendersons' front window was shattered completely, curtains billowing out like surrender flags. There were dark smears on the sidewalk and the curb that I chose not to examine closely. I counted 2 figures standing motionless in the middle of the road, approximately 4 houses north. They stood with their arms at their sides and their heads slightly tilted, not moving, not looking at anything specific, just standing, waiting for input. I moved to the kitchen. I grabbed the portable charger, a butcher knife, a roll of duct tape, a box of matches, and all the food that was calorie-dense and quiet to eat: peanut butter, crackers, dried fruit, cheese sticks. I filled 2 water bottles from the tap, unsure how long municipal water pressure would last. I packed everything into a hiking backpack from the hall closet and brought it to the basement. Elliot was ready. He'd put on his shoes, zipped his hoodie, and was standing at the bottom of the stairs with his hands at his sides like a soldier awaiting orders. We would go through the basement window well on the south side of the house, which opened into the narrow side yard between my house and the Pratchett's. From there, through the Pratchett's back gate, into the green belt that ran behind our development and connected to the W&OD trail. A paved bike path that cut through suburban Virginia and pointed westward toward the mountains. If we stayed on the trail, we'd have a direct line toward Purcellville and beyond it, Bluemont. 38 miles. My son had already walked 22 alone through worse conditions. Together, we could manage this. I removed the plywood from the south window well, popped the window latch, and pulled myself up into the gray morning air. The world smelled like wet leaves and something chemical underneath a faint acrid note, like burned plastic, that I would later learn was the smell of the infection itself, carried on the exhalations of the turned. I reached back down and pulled Elliot through. We crouched together in the side yard, breathing the new air of a world that had reorganized itself overnight. Then we moved. The W&OD trail was never empty on a normal Monday morning. Joggers and cyclists and dog walkers populated it from dawn until dark. A linear community of motion that stretched 45 miles from Arlington to Purcellville. Now it was a corridor of evidence. Abandoned bikes lay on their sides every quarter mile, some with wheels still spinning in the faint wind. A jogging stroller sat upright near a mile marker, empty, its canopy torn. Shoes appeared with an unnerving frequency: singles, always, as though people had run out of them 1 foot at a time. We moved at a pace Elliot set, which was faster than I expected. He walked with a deliberateness that favored silence over speed, placing each foot with the care of someone crossing a frozen lake. He'd learned this. 36 hours in the territory of the infected had taught a 9-year-old the biomechanics of quiet movement. I kept the Beretta in my waistband under my jacket and the butcher knife accessible in the side pocket of the backpack. The fixed blade knife from my footlocker hung on my belt. We stayed on the trail because the paved surface was quieter than grass or gravel, and the tree line on either side provided concealment options if we needed to vanish quickly. The first 3 miles passed without incident. The subdivisions flanking the trail were silent in the way that sleeping neighborhoods are silent, but with an additional quality, an emptiness beneath the quiet, as though the houses themselves had exhaled and not inhaled again. Curtains drawn, doors closed, no lights, no sounds of morning routines. Whether people were sheltering inside or gone, I couldn't determine, and I didn't want to investigate. At mile marker 17, we found a woman sitting on a bench beside the trail. She was alive, uninfected, and crying. Mid-30s, wearing hospital scrubs, green top, patterned pants with a laminated ID badge clipped to her chest. Her name tag read Priya Chandrasekaran, RN. She had blood on her hands and forearms, dried brown, and she was holding a phone that she kept trying to turn on by pressing the same cracked screen over and over. Elliot stopped walking. I stopped behind him. "Ma'am?" I said it softly, from 15 feet away. She looked up with swollen eyes and a face mapped with exhaustion. "Innova Loudon," she said, as though naming her hospital was the only introduction that mattered. "They overran us at 3 a.m. They came through the emergency department, through the waiting room. Patients in beds couldn't move. Staff on the night shift tried to barricade the ICU, but the doors weren't designed." She stopped. "There's no hospital anymore. Are you hurt? This blood isn't mine." She looked at her hands. "I don't even know whose it is. There were so many." I glanced at Elliot. He was watching Priya with something I hadn't seen from him yet. Recognition. Not of her specifically, but of her condition. He knew what it looked like when someone had witnessed the collapse of everything they understood about safety. "We're heading west," I said, "toward the mountains. You're welcome to come with us." Priya looked down the trail in both directions, then at the silent houses, then back at me. The calculation was visible trust, a stranger with a child, or sit on this bench until something found her. "I have medical training," she said, "if that's useful." "It's extremely useful." She stood and wiped her hands on her scrub pants, a gesture that accomplished nothing but gave her the feeling of preparation. She fell into step beside us, matching Elliot's careful pace without being told. "What do you know about the pathogen?" I asked as we walked. "It's not bacterial. Preliminary blood work at the hospital before we lost power suggested a prion-like protein, but it moves faster than any prion documented. Crosses the blood-brain barrier within hours. The aggression, the red eyes that's hemorrhaging in the conjunctival vessels from massive neurological inflammation. Higher brain function degrades rapidly. What's left is motor control, sensory processing, and something the infectious disease doctor called predatory persistence. They don't get tired. They don't eat. They just pursue. My son says they track faces." She looked at Elliot. "Visual imprinting. That's consistent with what I saw. They fixate on specific targets and ignore others. One of them walked past 3 staff members to reach a patient it had seen earlier through a window. It's not random. They hunt with intention." The trail curved northwest past the town of Ashburn proper. and ahead I could see the first overpass where Route 7 crossed above us. Under the overpass, in the permanent shadow of the concrete span, 4 figures stood motionless in a loose cluster. Their postures were identical, arms down, heads tilted, a faint swaying motion like trees in wind that wasn't blowing. We stopped. The 4 infected beneath the Route 7 overpass occupied the center of the trail. The space between the concrete support columns left approximately 8 feet of clearance on either side, enough for a person to pass, but close enough that a sudden lunge would close the distance before you could react. Priya gripped my forearm. We go around. I studied the terrain. The trail descended into a shallow cut through a hillside to pass beneath the overpass. On the left, the embankment rose steeply to the highway above. Climbable but noisy, covered in loose gravel and dead vegetation that would crunch underfoot. On the right, a chain-link fence separated the trail from a commercial property, an auto body shop. Its lot full of vehicles in various states of repair. "The fence," Elliot whispered. He pointed to a spot 20 yards ahead where the chain link had separated from its bottom rail, leaving a gap at ground level wide enough for a child to slide under. "You first," I whispered back. "Then Priya. I'll hold it up." We approached the gap in a low crouch, staying tight against the right side of the trail where a row of overgrown boxwood hedges provided visual cover from the overpass. The 4 infected hadn't moved, but their swaying had synchronized all 4 tilting in the same direction at the same interval, like metronomes accidentally aligned. Elliot went flat on his stomach, huias, and slid under the fence with the fluidity of a kid who'd spent his walk home finding gaps in exactly these kinds of barriers. Priya followed, struggling slightly where her scrub top caught on a bent wire, but she freed herself without sound. I handed the backpack through, then lifted the fence with both hands and rolled under, the chain link pressing cold against my back. We were in the body shop lot. Vehicles surrounded us, a lifted truck, 2 sedans with their hoods open, a minivan with its rear bumper hanging by one bolt. The shop itself was a corrugated metal building with 2 bay doors, both closed. A side door was ajar. "Through the lot and out the back," I said. "There should be a residential street on the other side." We moved between the vehicles in single file. The lot was oil-stained concrete, quiet under our feet. Priya walked close behind Elliot, her nurse's instinct putting her nearest to the smallest person. I brought up the rear, checking behind us every few steps. The ajar side door was a problem I noticed too late. It swung inward slightly as we passed, and from inside the dark shop came a sound, not a moan, not a growl, but a rapid clicking noise, like someone snapping their teeth together in a staccato rhythm. I'd heard nothing like it before. Priya had. She froze and her face drained of color so completely that her brown skin went gray. "Runner," she whispered. "That's what they sound like before they charge." At the hospital, the ones who still had recent motor function athletes, younger patients, they were faster. Much faster. The clicking is a precursor, some kind of involuntary jaw movement. "Move," I said. "Now, fast." We abandoned stealth. Elliot broke into a run toward the back of the lot where a wooden privacy fence separated the commercial property from the neighborhood behind it. The clicking from inside the shop intensified, and I heard the side door bang fully open against the wall and footsteps. Not the lurching drag of Diane Hargrove, but a full sprint, sneakers on concrete. Someone who had been fast before they turned, and was now faster because pain and fatigue had been removed from the equation. Priya screamed. It was involuntary, a burst of sound that she immediately cut off, but it was enough. Behind us, beneath the overpass, the four standing infected activated like a circuit completing. I didn't look back, but I heard them not running, but moving. That lurching, accelerated stumble closing distance at walking speed that was somehow faster than walking should be. Elliot hit the privacy fence and vaulted it with the adrenaline-fueled athleticism of pure terror. Priya scrambled over behind him, her scrubs tearing on the fence top. I turned at the fence and drew the Beretta. The runner came around the corner of a sedan 30 feet away. Male, young, wearing gym clothes and one shoe. His red eyes locked on my face with a focus that was worse than rage. It was recognition being born in real time. He saw me, and I became his. That was how the imprinting worked. I existed in his broken mind, now as a destination. I fired once. The sound was enormous in the morning quiet, a cannon blast that echoed off the overpass and the metal shop walls and rolled outward across the suburban landscape like a declaration. The round hit his left shoulder and spun him sideways but didn't drop him. Diminished pain response. Priya's words. I fired again, center mass, and he fell and skidded on the oily concrete, and then started getting back up. I went over the fence. We ran through backyards for 6 blocks. Over fences, through gates, past swing sets and dormant grills and garden beds where tomatoes were ripening for a harvest that nobody would collect. Elliot ran with a terrifying efficiency, choosing paths through each yard that avoided obstacles and maximized distance. He'd been doing this for 2 days before I ever started. The gunshots had changed the acoustic landscape. The 2 reports from my Beretta had sent a signal across the quiet suburban terrain, and I could hear responses, not gunfire, but movement. Distant crashes, breaking glass, the collective stirring of infected who had been standing dormant and were now activating in response to stimulus. Sound was a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples carried in every direction. We stopped in a detached garage behind a brick colonial that backed up to a drainage creek. The garage door was closed, the side door unlocked. Inside, a Subaru Outback, a workbench, and the thick smell of motor oil and sawdust. I pulled the door shut, and we stood in the darkness, breathing hard. "No more shooting," Priya said between gasps. "Every shot is a beacon." I know. I ejected the magazine and counted. 13 rounds remaining plus 1 in the chamber. I'd started with 2 magazines of 15. 30 total minus 2 fired. 28 rounds between me and everything that might come at us over 35 remaining miles. Elliot sat on the concrete floor with his back against the Subaru's rear tire. He wasn't winded the way Priya and I were. His body had already calibrated to this level of exertion. What concerned me was his expression, or rather, the absence of one. He'd retreated behind that internal door again, the one I'd seen when he first arrived on my porch. The sprint had pushed him from tactical mode back into survival mode, and in survival mode, Elliot became a mechanism. "Hey," I knelt in front of him. "You did great. You got us through those yards." His eyes focused on me slowly, like a camera adjusting its lens. "The gun was too loud. You're right. I won't use it unless there's absolutely no choice." "There's always a choice. You can run instead." He wasn't wrong. And the fact that he was correcting my tactical decisions while sitting on a stranger's garage floor should have been surreal. But the surreal had been replaced by the operational. This was reality now, and reality had a 9-year-old consultant. Priya checked the Subaru. The doors were unlocked. Keys were not in the ignition and not on the workbench or the hook board by the door. She popped the glove compartment registration, insurance card, a pack of tissues. If we could find keys to a car anywhere along this route, we could cover the distance in under an hour, she said. Roads might be impassable. Route 7 overpass had vehicles stopped on it. Back roads then. Route 287 north through Purcellville runs through farmland. Less traffic, less population density. I pulled up the mental map. She was right about the terrain, but driving introduced noise engine noise, tire noise, the sound of a functioning vehicle in a world where functioning vehicles had become rare. We'd be a moving sound source, and every infected within earshot would orient toward us. We walk, I said, but we aim for 287 and use the road shoulder where the terrain is open enough to see threats coming. Priya accepted this with a nurse's pragmatism. She'd offered the option. I'd made the call. We moved forward. No argument, no residual debate. I checked my phone. 29%. One text from Ray, sent 40 minutes ago. Heading south. Chidi turned and I had to handle it. Grace is catatonic. Lisa's driving. Kids are in the back. Don't ask me more. Just survive, brother. I closed the text and didn't reply. Ray Callahan had killed a 7-year-old boy who was no longer a 7-year-old boy. And the distance between those two truths was the distance between sanity and whatever lay on its other side. We waited in the garage for 20 minutes until the ambient sounds of activated infected had faded. Then we slipped out the side door, crossed the drainage creek on stepping stones, and pushed into a wooded strip that paralleled Route 287. The trees closed around us like a sentence with no ending, and we walked. We encountered the farmhouse at mile 19, set back from Route 287 behind a gravel drive lined with black walnut trees. White clapboard, green shutters, a wraparound porch with 2 rocking chairs positioned to watch the sunset over the Blue Ridge. It looked like a painting of the Virginia everyone imagined, and no one actually lived in. Too clean, too composed, too deliberately American. A barn sat 50 yards behind it, its red paint fading to the color of dried blood. And beyond that, soybean fields stretched toward a tree line half a mile south. We'd been walking for 6 hours. Elliot's pace had slowed in the last mile, not from fatigue, but from hypoglycemia. I recognized the slightly unfocused gaze, the deliberate placement of each step. He needed calories and rest. I needed to assess our route forward while we still had daylight. The farmhouse appeared unoccupied. No vehicles in the drive, no lights, no movement behind windows. But appearance meant nothing in this environment, as both the living and the dead could occupy silent houses with equal stillness. I told Priya and Elliot to wait at the tree line while I approached. I walked up the gravel drive, each footstep crunching despite my attempts to walk on the grass shoulder. The front door was closed, but not locked. I pushed it open with the knife extended and stepped into a foyer that smelled of lemon cleaning solution and coffee grounds. The smell of a house that had been lived in recently and left quickly. The living room was intact. Kitchen undisturbed. Dishes in the drying rack, a coffee maker with half a pot still sitting on the warming plate. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, all beds made, closets open with gaps in the clothing someone had packed in a hurry and left. The bathroom medicine cabinet was mostly empty, but they'd left behind ibuprofen, bandages, and a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. I took everything. Downstairs, I opened the pantry and found it modestly stocked. Canned beans, soup, tuna, a bag of rice, pasta, jarred tomato sauce, peanut butter, crackers. Enough for several days, more than I could carry, but I could select and prioritize. I waved Priya and Elliot inside. Elliot went straight to the kitchen table and sat down with the automated compliance of someone who'd learned that when shelter appeared, you used it immediately. Priya moved through the rooms with clinical assessment checking water pressure, still functioning. examining the back door locks, deadbolt solid, cataloging the windows, 12 total, all ground floor vulnerable, all with functioning locks but single pane glass. I opened 2 cans of soup and heated them on the gas stove, which still ignited from the propane tank outside. We ate in the kitchen with the curtains drawn and our voices low. 3 strangers bound by circumstance, sharing chicken noodle soup while civilization rearranged itself outside. "How far to the cabin?" Priya asked. 19 miles, through the gap between Short Hill Mountain and the Blue Ridge. The terrain gets steep and wooded, harder walking but much less population. "Can we make it before dark?" I calculated. 6 hours of daylight remaining. 19 miles of increasingly difficult terrain. With Elliot's pace and the need for caution, we'd average maybe 2.5 miles per hour. That put us arriving well after sunset. "We can stay here tonight and leave at first light," I said. "This house is defensible. 1 entry point on each side, good sight lines from the upper windows, and it's set far enough from the road that casual foot traffic won't find us." "What about intentional foot traffic?" Priya asked. "The living, I mean, not the infected." She was raising a point I'd been avoiding. The living were their own category of threat. In the hospital, she told us, staff had turned on each other before the infected even reached the upper floor's arguments over who got to leave first. A security guard who'd locked an entire ward of patients inside to seal the corridor. 2 doctors fighting over the last set of car keys in the physician lot. "We take shifts watching from the upstairs window," I said. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. I'll take the first watch." Elliot spoke without looking up from his soup. "There are people in the barn." The spoon stopped halfway to Priya's mouth. I looked at my son. "How do you know?" "I saw the barn door move when we walked up the drive, just a crack. And there's a padlock on the outside that's hanging open. If it was locked from outside, nobody's in there. But it's open, which means someone went in and didn't lock it behind them." I set my spoon down and picked up the knife. The walk from the farmhouse back door to the barn was 50 yards of open ground, with no cover except a chicken coop halfway between. I crossed it alone, knife in hand, Beretta in waistband, moving in a low profile that wouldn't mean anything if whoever was inside the barn was watching through the gap Elliot had spotted. The barn door was a sliding type, mounted on an overhead rail. The padlock hung from the hasp, unlocked, exactly as Elliot had described. I positioned myself to the hinge side and pushed the door open 6 inches. "I know you're in there," I said, keeping my voice steady and conversational. "I'm armed. I have no interest in fighting. But you should know there are 3 of us in the house and we'll defend it." Silence. Then a woman's voice, thready and high with tension. "We're not infected. Please don't shoot. We have children." I pushed the door open further. The barn interior was dim, hay-smelling, with stalls along one side and open floor on the other. Farm equipment, a tractor, a tiller, stacks of feed bags. In the far corner, behind a wall of hay bales arranged as a barricade, 4 faces peered out at me. A woman in her late 40s with short, gray-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses. A man roughly the same age, heavy-set, wearing a flannel shirt dark with sweat. Between them, 2 teenagers, a girl maybe 16, and a boy maybe 14. Siblings by the resemblance around their eyes and jawlines. "I'm Marianne Kessler," the woman said. "This is my husband Donald. Our children, Sophie and Aiden. We lived about 2 miles south on Hillsborough Road. We left when our neighbors started turning. We've been in this barn since last night." "Why not the house?" Donald spoke. His voice was deeper than his wife's, but carried the same strain. We didn't know if it was occupied. Didn't want to break in and find something we couldn't handle. It's empty. The owners evacuated. There's food and working utilities. Marianne's composure cracked just enough to show what was beneath it, relief so profound it bordered on collapse. She pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed through her fingers. "Come inside," I said. "But I need to check each of you first. Bites, scratches, any broken skin." Donald stiffened. "Now wait honey?" Marianne put her hand on his arm. "He's being smart. We'd want the same." They filed out of the barn, and I examined each of them in the late afternoon light. No bites, no scratches, no discoloration of the eyes. Priya confirmed from the porch, her medical assessment faster and more authoritative than mine. She checked pulses, pupil dilation, skin temperature, all clear. Inside the farmhouse, the Kesslers entered the kitchen with the dazed reverence of people entering a church. Sophie, the 16-year-old, saw the stove and asked in a voice that was heartbreakingly young whether the water worked. Priya turned on the tap, and Sophie started crying. Not dramatically, not with sobs, just a silent streaming of tears down a face that had been holding everything for too long. Aiden, the 14-year-old, sat next to Elliot at the kitchen table. The two boys regarded each other with the mutual assessment of adolescent males, a sizing up that transcended the apocalypse. "How old are you?" Aiden asked. 9. "You seem older." "I walked here from Leesburg." Aiden stared at him. Whatever hierarchy he'd been constructing in his head reorganized immediately. Donald stood by the back window and watched the fields with the vigilance of a man who'd been a prey animal for 24 hours and hadn't yet adjusted to the possibility of walls and doors. His hands opened and closed at his sides in a rhythm that matched his breathing. Marianne sat at the table and organized information. She'd been a project manager before the world changed the instinct to categorize, and plan was tattooed into her operating system. "How many infected have you seen between here and Ashburn?" I told her. "The overpass group, the runner at the body shop, the ambient movement after the gunshots." She absorbed it and nodded in a way that I recognized she was building a mental map, populating it with threat data, calculating probabilities. "We heard on a neighbor's radio before we left that they're concentrated along population corridors," she said. "Highways, commercial districts, anywhere people gathered. Rural areas have fewer because there were fewer people to turn. But they migrate. They follow sound and movement, and when they can't find either, they spread outward in search patterns." Search patterns? Organized, not random. One of our neighbors who turned he was a retired biologist. Before he fully changed, in the hours between the bite and the loss of speech, he described what he was feeling. He said it was like a signal filling his mind, telling him where to go. He said it felt cooperative, like a hive. The word hive sat in the kitchen like a fifth person, occupying its own chair, demanding attention. We settled into the farmhouse like castaways making a raft from wreckage. Each person found a role without discussion, as though the structure of a functioning group was as instinctive as breathing. Donald secured the ground floor, checking every lock, wedging chairbacks under doorknobs, testing the strength of window frames. Marianne inventoried the pantry and rationed supplies into meal-sized portions, writing her calculations on the back of a grocery receipt she found in a kitchen drawer. Sophie and Aiden carried mattresses downstairs from the bedrooms, arranging them in the living room where we could all sleep in the same space. Priya established a medical station on the dining room table. The ibuprofen, bandages, peroxide, plus a sewing kit she'd found in a bedroom closet that she said could serve for suturing if circumstances demanded. Elliot sat on the kitchen counter and watched the fields through a gap in the curtains, My son had become the group's early warning system without anyone appointing him to the role. His eyes were sharper than ours, his stillness more absolute, and his understanding of infected behavior was the closest thing we had to intelligence. Darkness came at 7:42 p.m. We killed all lights. The farmhouse settled into a blackness broken only by the faint ambient glow from a sky that still reflected distant fires' orange smudges along the eastern horizon where Leesburg or Ashburn or both were burning. I took the first watch from the upstairs bedroom window. The fields were silver gray under cloud-filtered starlight, the soybeans swaying in unison like a single organism. The tree line to the south was a dark wall. Route 287 was invisible behind the walnut trees. But I could occasionally hear sounds from that direction, a distant car engine revving and then dying. Once a burst of what might have been automatic weapons fire. And beneath it all, the constant low-frequency murmur of the infected, a sound that reminded me of how stadium crowds sounded from miles away. A blurred roar that could have been anything. At 10:30 p.m., Donald came upstairs to relieve me. He carried a baseball bat he'd found in a hall closet and held it the way a man holds something he doesn't believe will save him, but needs to hold anyway. "I need to ask you something," he said. He stood beside the window and looked out at the fields with me. "My kids, Sophie and Aiden. If this goes wrong, if we get overrun, I need someone who can move fast with them. I'm not that person." He touched his chest. "Cardiac stents, 2 of them. I can't sprint. I can barely jog." "It won't come to that." "It might." I watched my neighbor of 12 years try to eat his wife's face, Ben. Everything can come to everything now. I met his eyes in the darkness. "If it comes to that, your kids come with us." He nodded once and looked back out the window. "Marianne thinks we should all go to your cabin. She ran the numbers. 8 people is a sustainable group for resource management if the location has adequate supply lines. She says the mountains give us elevation advantage, natural barriers, and reduced exposure to population migration routes." She's not wrong. She usually isn't. 23 years of marriage, and I've been right about 4 times. I almost smiled. Almost. The impulse to laugh existed in the same space as the impulse to scream. And both were held at bay by the necessity of functioning. I went downstairs and lay on a mattress next to Elliot. He was asleep, his hand curled around a flashlight he'd taken from my backpack. I looked at his face in the dim orange glow from the horizon and tried to see the boy who had argued with me 3 weeks ago about bedtime, who had spilled juice on his homework and cried, not because the homework was ruined, but because he thought I'd be disappointed. That boy was still in there. I was certain of it. He was just sharing space with someone else now, a survivor who understood things no 9-year-old should understand, and had accepted them with a practicality that made my throat ache. I closed my eyes and slept. And in my dreams, I stood in Karen's apartment, and she was locking Elliot's bedroom door while Marcus shook on the kitchen floor, and her hands were steady, and her face was terrified, and she didn't hesitate. She didn't hesitate. I woke at 4 a.m. to Elliot's hand on my shoulder. "Dad, there's someone on the porch." The someone on the porch was a man in his 20s, visible through the sidelight in the same position Diane Hargrove had occupied on my porch 24 hours and a lifetime ago. But this man wasn't infected. He was pressing his forehead against the glass, and his breath was fogging it, and he was whispering "please" over and over in a voice that sounded like paper tearing. Behind him, in the gravel driveway, 2 infected stood at the edge of the walnut tree line. They weren't approaching the house. They were watching the man on the porch, with the patient stillness of animals that had already decided the outcome of a hunt and were simply waiting for the formality of conclusion. I woke Donald and Priya. Mary Ann was already awake, sitting upright on her mattress with the alertness of a woman who hadn't truly slept. "If we open that door, we expose every person in this house," Donald said. "If we don't, we listen to him die," Priya said. "He might be bitten," Mary Ann said. "He's running from them, which means they were close enough to contact." Through the sidelight, I studied the man. He wore a denim jacket and jeans, work boots, no visible injuries from this angle. His whispered pleading continued unbroken, a loop of desperation that sawed at the conscience. Elliot stood behind me, watching. The two in the driveway aren't moving because they're waiting. If we open the door, the light and sound will activate them. We'd have about 4 seconds before they reach the porch. 4 seconds is enough, I said. Not if he's frozen. Scared people freeze in doorways. My son was right. I'd seen it in combat. Soldiers who reached cover and then stopped moving because the relief of partial safety paralyzed them at the threshold. I made the decision in the space between 2 heartbeats. "Donald, stand behind the door with the bat. Priya, be ready to check him. Elliot, you and the Kessler kids stay in the kitchen. If anything gets through this door that isn't human, you go out the back and you run for the tree line." Sophie and Aiden were already awake, standing in the living room doorway. Sophie had her arm around her brother and her jaw set in a way that mirrored her mother's expression exactly. I unlocked the deadbolt. I gripped the door handle. Through the sidelight, I saw the 2 infected in the driveway shift their weight forward simultaneously, like sprinters settling into blocks. I threw the door open, grabbed the man by his jacket collar, and hauled him inside with a force that sent both of us sprawling onto the foyer floor. Donald slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, and wedged the chair back under the knob in a single sequence of movements that took less than 3 seconds. A body hit the outside of the door at second 4 with an impact that shook the frame and sent plaster dust drifting from the ceiling. The man on the floor was gasping, curled on his side. Priya was on him immediately, checking his pupils, his skin, pulling at his jacket collar and sleeves looking for wounds. "No bites," she reported. "No scratches, pupils normal, he's clean." "Thank you," the man said. He said it 17 times before he could say anything else. I counted because counting had become my anchor. His name was Jesse Odom. He was 24, a wildfire crew foreman for the Virginia Department of Forestry stationed out of a facility near Round Hill. He'd been driving back from an assignment in the Shenandoah when the road closures started, and he'd abandoned his truck on Route 7 and walked south and then west and then north again, disoriented and exhausted, for 14 hours. "The mountains," he said, sitting up against the wall while Priya made him drink water. "I've worked these mountains for 3 years. I know every fire road, every trail, every ridgeline from Snickers Gap to Harper's Ferry. If you're trying to get into the high ground, I can get you there faster and safer than any map." I looked at Mary Ann. She looked back at me with the expression of a woman whose calculations had just received a new variable that improved the equation. "We leave at first light," I said. "All of us." Outside, the 2 infected on the porch struck the door again, and then settled into that patient rhythm. 3 hits. Pause. 3 hits. Pause, the same cadence Diane Hargrove had used. As though somewhere in their degraded circuitry, a common protocol governed how they asked permission to destroy you. We left the farmhouse at 5:48 a.m. through the back door in a single-file column. Jesse on point, then me, then Elliot, then Priya, then Sophie and Aiden, then Mary Ann, with Donald bringing up the rear. 8 people moving through soybean fields toward the western tree line, while the sky blushed pink and the air carried that cold edge. Elliot had identified as the infected's weakness. The 2 from the porch had migrated to the front of the house during the night and were standing motionless in the gravel driveway, facing the front door like congregants before an altar. They didn't see us leave. Elliot had timed our departure to the minute when the sun was lowest and the house cast its longest shadow across the backyard, keeping us in darkness for the first 60 feet. Jesse moved through the terrain with the confidence of a man who had spent years reading landscapes for fire risk slope, vegetation density, wind patterns, access routes. He led us along a creek bed that curved southwest toward the base of Short Hill Mountain, keeping us below the sight line of the surrounding fields and providing the sound-dampening benefit of running water. "There's a fire road on the north face of Short Hill," he told me as we walked. "It connects to a network of service trails that run parallel to the AT. Your cabin near Bluemont. I think I know the area. There's a cluster of hunting properties off Snickersville Turnpike, back in the hollow. That's it. Gravel road, no name, about a mile past the old mill. I've cleared brush there. I know that road. We can be on it by mid-afternoon if we take the fire road over the ridge instead of going around." The group settled into the rhythm of movement with a cohesion that surprised me. 8 strangers, assembled by accident and necessity, walking through the Virginia Piedmont toward mountains that represented nothing more certain than distance from other human beings. But certainty was a currency that had been devalued overnight, and distance was the closest substitute. Sophie walked beside Elliot, and I watched a conversation develop between them that seemed to require very few words. She'd ask a quiet question. He'd answer in a sentence or less. She'd nod. They were communicating in the compressed dialect of people conserving energy for things more important than speech. Aiden walked with his mother and matched her pace with the protective awareness of a boy who'd watched his father admit physical limitation and had quietly decided to compensate. He carried the baseball bat Donald had relinquished without either of them discussing it. Priya walked alone in the middle of the column, her eyes moving constantly, scanning the tree line and the fields and the creek bed and the sky in a pattern that reminded me of triage, assess, prioritize, move to next. We reached the base of Short Hill Mountain at 9:30 a.m. The fire road was where Jesse said it would be a gravel track cutting upward through mixed hardwood forest, wide enough for a single vehicle, overgrown enough to confirm it hadn't been used recently. The ascent was steep for the first quarter mile, and Donald's breathing became a concern. Marianne walked beside him with her hand on his back, not supporting his weight, but maintaining contact, a tether. "Rest," I said when we reached a switchback with a clearing. Donald sat on a fallen log and pressed his hand to his chest. His color was gray, but his eyes were clear. "I'm slowing you down. You're keeping up. Don't manage me, Ben. I know what I am. You're a man walking his family to safety. That's what you are." He looked at me, and in that look, I saw the full weight of what this cost him, the knowledge that his body was a liability, that his heart might fail on this mountain and leave his children without a father in a world that had started eating people alive. He carried that knowledge with a dignity that made my chest tight. We rested for 10 minutes. Elliot sat apart from the group and watched the valley below us. From this elevation, we could see the landscape we'd crossed. The farmhouse was a white speck amid the green fields, Route 287 a gray thread. And beyond it, the sprawl of suburban northern Virginia under a haze that might have been morning mist or smoke or both. "I can see them," Elliot said. I moved to where he sat and followed his gaze. On the road below, visible as specks of movement, a loose group of figures walked north along Route 287. Not a pack, more like a dispersal pattern, spread across the road and the shoulders and into the fields on either side, moving in the same direction with the same pace. Migration, Jesse said from behind us. They're moving away from the population centers, spreading outward, looking for new stimulus. Heading toward the mountains, toward us eventually, if we stayed still long enough. We move, I said, and we did. The cabin appeared through the trees at 3:17 p.m. Like something from a memory I wasn't sure I'd actually lived. Log walls darkened by decades of weather, a stone chimney listing slightly starboard, a covered porch with 2 split-bottom chairs my grandfather had made. The gravel road that led to it was overgrown with pokeweed and goldenrod. The tire tracks from my last visit 2 years ago, long since erased by seasons of rain and growth. I unlocked the front door with a key that had been on my ring through the entire divorce. Through every custody exchange. Through every ordinary Tuesday that now felt like something from an ancient civilization. The cabin exhaled a breath of cedar and dust and cold wood stove ash. Inside, 2 rooms and a loft. A main room with the wood stove, a table, 4 chairs, a couch. A back room with 2 sets of bunk beds my father had built for hunting parties. The loft held a double mattress and a trunk of blankets. The root cellar was accessed through a hatch in the main room floor. I opened it and descended the ladder and found what I expected. My father's inventory. Rows of canned goods arranged by type and date. 10-pound bags of rice and dried beans in sealed buckets, a shelf of bottled water, a first aid kit more comprehensive than anything I'd assembled. And in the corner, a gun safe containing a shotgun, a hunting rifle, and sufficient ammunition to suggest my father had been preparing for something he'd never named. The well pump still worked. The wood stove was sound. The chimney would need to be checked before we lit a fire. But Jesse said he could climb to the roof and inspect it. The windows were small and high designed, more for rifle defense than aesthetics. Because my grandfather had built this cabin during a time when the mountains held threats that walked on 2 legs and 4. 8 people in a cabin built for 6 was manageable. Tight, but manageable. Marianne took inventory of the root cellar with the intensity of a woman who'd found her purpose. She calculated that the existing supplies, supplemented by whatever we could hunt or forage, would sustain 8 people for approximately 4 months. Longer if we rationed aggressively. 4 months. The math of survival reduced to a single question: what would the world look like in 4 months? And would it still have room for us? Donald sat on the porch with his bat across his knees and watched the tree line with an expression that had shifted from vigilance to something approaching peace. The mountains surrounded us on 3 sides, their ridgelines forming a natural amphitheater with the cabin at its center. Anything approaching by land would be visible from the porch for the last quarter mile. The creek that ran behind the property provided water, and the ambient noise that Elliot had identified as beneficial flowing water confused their auditory tracking. We were defensible. We were supplied. We were, for the first time since Elliot had rung my doorbell 24 hours ago, something other than running. Jesse and Aiden walked the perimeter and identified 3 potential approach routes that needed monitoring. Sophie and Priya organized the sleeping arrangements, allocating the bunks to the Kessler family, the loft to Jesse and me in rotation, and the couch area to Priya and Elliot. Elliot didn't argue. He studied the cabin's interior with the same careful attention he'd given to every environment since his walk home, mapping exits, assessing structural vulnerabilities, calculating angles. Then he went to the porch and sat in one of my grandfather's chairs. The chair was too big for him, and his feet didn't touch the floor, and in that moment, in the amber light of late afternoon, filtering through the mountain canopy, my son looked exactly like what he was, a 9-year-old boy who wanted to sit in a big chair and swing his feet and not think about anything harder than whether dinner would be dinosaur nuggets or chicken tenders. I sat in the other chair. We looked at the mountains together. Dad? Yeah, buddy. Mom saved me. I know. I want to remember that. Even when I remember the other parts, I want the biggest thing I remember to be that she saved me. I reached over and took his hand. His fingers curled around mine with a grip that was both a child's need and a survivor's strength. And I held on to both. Below us, in the valley, the world was rewriting itself in a language of hunger and loss. Above us, the ridge caught the last of the sunlight and turned it gold. The creek behind the cabin spoke in its continuous voice, covering our sounds, filling the silence with something that wasn't quite peace, but lived in the same neighborhood. 8 people, 1 cabin, the mountains on all sides like cupped hands. We would hold what we could hold, for as long as we could hold it. That was the only promise the world still honored. I write this on the 14th night. The propane lantern throws shadows on log walls that have watched generations survive what they were not designed to survive. Downstairs, 7 people sleep in the arrangements that have already become ritual. Donald by the door, Marianne beside him, Sophie and Aiden in their bunks, breathing in synchronized rhythm. Priya on the floor near the medical station she's built from my father's supplies and her own relentless competence. Jesse by the window, one eye perpetually open, the firefighter's instinct to watch. Elliot sleeps with Sergeant Stomps. I retrieved the stuffed triceratops from our house during a supply run on day 5. The most dangerous thing I've done, and the most necessary. My son holds it with both hands while he sleeps. And during the day he sets it on the shelf and becomes the tactician, the scout, the boy who walked through the apocalypse in a red hoodie and arrived home to tell me not to open the door. He is both. He will always be both. Karen saved him. That is the fixed star by which this entire narrative orients. A woman I'd argued with about property division and holiday schedules put her body between a monster and her son and did not move. I don't know what the world becomes. I know what we become inside it, people who hold on, who watch the ridgeline, who keep the fire low and the doors locked and the children close. People who remember that the biggest thing is always the saving. The creek speaks, the mountain holds, we remain.